book that everybody should read for this summer, which I think is imperative if you're concerned about your health at all, and it's called The Story of the Human Body by Daniel Lieberman from Harvard University.
Best book of all, The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Luis Zafón, a Spanish writer. Fabulous book.
Well, I just finished reading The Gold Finch by Donna Tartt. Over 700 pages, so a long read, but a good read.
I'm reading Revolutionary Road because my son is reading it for an American Lit class, so I thought I'd read along with him.
There you go. That one? Boys in the Boat.
Well, I'm reading Bill Bryson's A Short History of Just About Everything, nearly everything. Great book, required reading for everyone.
Well, we read by Stanley Harvas, the theologian from Duke University, and his autobiography called Hannah's Child. It is just a very moving book.
Okay, confession. I put Orange is the New Black on my Kindle because I just finished watching season 2 and I wanted a little more.
All right, all good picks, and I just read Revolutionary Road. Joining me now to share their favorite page-turners are Julie Wu, who is the author of The Third Son, Randy Susan Myers. Her new book, Accidents of Marriage, will be released in September, and Jabari Asim. He's an associate professor of writing, literature, and publishing at Emerson College. His most recent book is 50 Cents and a Dream. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
So we're just going to get right to work here. We're going to start with you, Julie. Fiction, and your book involves a couple things I really love. Running, first of all, but it's told through the point of view of a child.
Yeah, this book, Running the Rift, it's by Naomi Ben Aran, and it's set in Rwanda at the time of the genocide, sort of the build-up to the genocide in Rwanda, and it is about a boy who aspires to be a runner in the Olympics, and so it's sort of an interesting sort of lead-up contrast to the background of the story.
And now, Jabari, with your fiction, you take us to the Civil War.
Yes, Song of the Shank by Jeffrey Bernard Allen. It's actually his second novel. His first novel was called Rails Under My Back. And his reputation has been building, and I think we're now at a point where we are really going to become familiar with him as a novelist. And it revolves around a actual historical figure named Blind Tom, or Thomas Wiggins. And he was a musical prodigy, African-American musical prodigy, in the late 19th century.
Oh, that sounds. These all sound so fascinating already. Yours, this is set in the 1980s, and a family bound by bigamy. Is that part of it?
This is one of my favorite books that I've read in the last 10 years, and I'm just going to read the first line because it says everything.
It's called The Silver Sparrow.
Silver Sparrow by TAYARI Jones. My father, James Witherspoon, is a bigamist. I mean, that is a strong opening line. And this book has form and function. It is beautifully written, and the story will just have you whipping through those pages, and it's two girls, same father, only one knows, and it is a phenomenally good book.
So it holds up from that very provocative first sentence.
It does. It really does. You know, you can always come up with a good line, but can you go all the way through? Ms. Jones does it well.
All right, Julie, we're going to come back to you now as we head into our nonfiction section. And you have brought Behind the Beautiful Flowers, which this sounds really interesting, too, because it takes us to a place that a lot of us don't even see covered in media and newspapers necessarily.
Yeah, Catherine Boo's book, Behind the Beautiful Forevers, it takes place in the slums of Mumbai. So actually, it is nonfiction, but she really embedded herself in that community. So it reads as richly, really, as a novel. It's amazing. And it's really really interesting to see that sort of layer of poverty, or the depths of poverty that they live in and that they still are managing to survive in.
So it's from what I understand, it's the neighborhood, but it's told through different stories, and is it different?
It's about a whole community. It's about a whole community that basically lives around a sewage lake, and that makes their living through garbage. A lot of it, that they sell garbage, they sort it, they return it to recycling centers, things like that. And it's all about sort of the different layers of corruption as well, because they feel, you know, whenever they turn to people for help, they find out that those people are trying to get money from them too. It's really, yeah. But at the same time, it is uplifting. I'm having all these like depressing stories, but it is, you know, all these stories are really about sort of overcoming terrible, terrible adversity.
Well, Jabari is not helping on the uplifting front. Yours is about writers.
Well, yeah. It's called A Movable Famine by John Scoyles, who's a local professor. And quite coincidentally, 3 of the authors on my stack are primarily poets, but are writing in different genres. And so Scoyles is a decorated poet, but here we have a memoir, mostly about the 1970s, his time developing as a writer, spending time in New York with so there are a lot of well-known writers, and he's also at the Iowa Writers Workshop, spends a lot of time in Provincetown. So if you're sort of into the inside baseball side of writing, this is a good book for you.
Well, it sounds delicious because it sounds like it gets beneath. I mean, there are reasons that there are so many stories about writers and their behavior, which I'm sure applies to none of you here on this panel.
We don't know anything about that.
No late night binge drinking and whatnot, but it does get into what makes an artist an artist.
Yes, and it does have that aspect of it. There's a lot of hard living as well as hard writing. So there is a lot of drinking. There's partying. It has a fairly healthy portion of what we might call highbrow gossip.
Yeah,
for sure.
Great. Yeah. Now, Randy, I have to make a confession here. Your book is Knowing Jesse, written by Marianne Leone, who's a friend of mine, who's been on this panel before. And I will tell you that I actually have not been able to read her book because I'm a little bit afraid because of the subject matter, which you'll share with us.
I think that too many people do that, and I actually was a little nervous about reading it because everybody knows that what the end is going to be, that her son, Jesse, dies when he's 16 years old. But I read it, and I'm so glad I did, because reading this book actually made me braver for a couple of reasons. One is that the things that Marianne and her husband, Chris Cooper, do for Jesse are just amazing. And he's wonderful.
So brilliant.
Brilliant, and the way that Marianne and Chris fight the system to get him what he needs is phenomenal. Marianne's writing is light as a feather. And by that, I don't mean that she doesn't bring in the depth, but she does it in such a way that's funny and right there, and you're with her. She is a brilliant writer. She's a brilliant mother. And this is the bravest I felt was after finishing her book. And it's a wonderful read. I can't recommend it highly enough.
And everybody's talked about the humor, too. Between you and a member of our staff here, I will read it now because it's such an amazing story. So thank you for bringing that one. So we're going to make another turn now to young adult, which, of course, has become this huge boon industry here. So, Julie, you have Not a Drop to Drink. And this is, for fans, I understand, a frontier stories.
Well, it is a dystopian novel, and it's funny because I have been reading, books like Running the Rift and Behind the Beautiful Forevers. I've been interested in that because my book is also my writing centers on Taiwan in a repressive era, and so I've been reading books kind of like that, and I thought there was sort of a subgenre, like a little niche, and then I realized, then I saw The Hunger Games, and I was like, that's the same thing. It's I think a lot of this dystopian literature is sort of exploring that same concept of being the underdog in a repressive regime, and so this is an example of that by Mindy McGinnis, and it's sort of set in this future time when natural resources are coming to an end, and water is a precious resource that you have to guard, kind of, and in this case with your life. So there's this girl, Lynn, who owns a pond, and she basically sits on her roof sharpshooting anyone who comes nearby.
Yikes.
So
this is young adult?
It is young adult in the line of Hunger Games. But it's really interesting because over the book she does develop, and so it's actually in a way it's a dystopia for people who enjoy good characterization and good writing, because some young adult fiction doesn't stress that, but I kind of like this, and the characters do stay with you.
All right, well, moving on to you, Jabari. You have a basketball book. It's told in verse, or written in verse, I should say.
That's correct. It's called The Crossover by Kwame Alexander, whom I've known for a long time as a poet. But a few years ago, he began to branch out into children's book writing and young adult writing, and he brought his poetic tendencies, shall we say, with him. So it is a novel written in verse. It's about identical twins who play basketball, their junior high age, and what happens when a girl gets in between them. And they're basketball prodigies. It's well written, but I think one of the other interesting things about this book is we're always talking about what can we find that boys will read. And while I think this book will be perfectly appealing to girls, it is a book that you can hand to a young adult boy. Young adult boy, that's an odd phrase. A junior high, middle school type boy, and he will read it with enthusiasm, so I recommend it.
And have boys been reading it?
I think so. I've been in touch with Kwame, and he's actually had some very large audiences at book signings around the country. So there is every indication. It's gotten very good reviews in the Washington Post and New York Times. So there's every indication that attention is building for it, and deservedly so.
All right. And Randy, you have a book for young aspiring artists, which I love.
Or young ballerinas.
They're artists.
They're artists. The thing that's very special about this, it's about a troupe that's brought together by the author, Lauren Thompson, of ballerinas with cerebral palsy. And it is a wonderful book. It sparkles as much as the girls do. And the message that's there, which is so important, is that you really can do just about everything. I think is as important for any child to read. So I got this for my granddaughter when she was little, and we read this over and over and over. And it's not just a message; it's just a beautiful book. And the photographs by James Estrin are fabulous.
All right, now we're going to switch to one of my favorite genres, guilty pleasures. Julie, I recognize yours. I haven't read it, but I did see the movie.
Yeah, well, I haven't seen the movie. I have read the book, and I have to say I have to say that I've gotten into some arguments with writer friends about this book because some people do trash it, but I was up till 3 a.m. reading this book, and I think that says something. I mean, I love that experience of being up. Honestly, I was reading Behind the Beautiful Forever as well. My son was reading Divergent, and I was like, come on, time to go to bed. And he's like, no.
Well, it speaks volumes.
Yeah. So after he was finished with it, I was like, I want that, and I read it, and I really, I mean, it's not, it's not going to win any Nobel prizes or anything, but it was definitely riveting and
great.
Yeah, fun.
And Jabari, you have The 12.
The 12 by Justin Cronin, which is a follow-up to an earlier book. It's part of a trilogy. The earlier book was called The Passage. And Justin Cronin has an interesting background because he wrote a couple of well-received literary novels before launching an exploration into what we might call genre writing. And he brings a lot of that literary technique to the storytelling, I would argue. So it's a post-apocalyptic story about vampires and scientific experiments gone awry, an overactive military, some of the aspects that we might find in these other stories as well. But I think if you're somewhat allergic to what you might think of as lowbrow fiction, he's a good spot to begin.
All right, and finally, Randy, The Little Bride. What is The Little Bride?
Well, Little Bride is not well, I don't feel guilty about reading anything.
Yes.
But it's certainly something you can get through on the beach. It's a gripping read about a 16-year-old who's taken from Odessa as a mail-order bride back in, oh my goodness, back when our country was first being put together. And she's taken to South Dakota. And not only is she taken to South Dakota as a mail-order bride from Odessa, it's at the turn of the century, but she's Jewish, and you wouldn't think that there would be a Jewish home out in South Dakota at the turn of the century with a mail-order bride. She wasn't happy.
I guess not.
And the guilty pleasure part is that she finds the son, this much older guy, real attractive.
All right, well, I'm going to take priority here, and I have a book too. It's Wendy. I'm reading this right now. I love biographies. It's my favorite thing to read. Right now I'm reading Wendy and the Lost Boys. It's about the Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright Wendy Wasserstein, and it is such a great picture of her as an artist and a picture of that time in New York, this 1970s, 80s. It's great, so I suggest that too. Thank you all so much for coming.